The movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit was released in 1988, and it was loosely based off of the 1981 novel Who Censored Roger Rabbit by Gary K. Wolfe. The film was set in a 1947 version of Hollywood where basically cartoon characters and humans coexist amongst one another. The film follows human Eddie Valiant, who is a private investigator, gets tasked with clearing Roger Rabbit's name when he is accused of murdering a wealthy businessman. If you've ever seen Roger's character, you know how unlikely it is that Roger would be the one to have killed off this wealthy businessman. As fondly as this film is remembered today, it was actually a bit of a nightmare for Disney during production, and it was largely regarded to be this like headache of a project. It was very, very, very difficult for them. The budget like massively ballooned beyond what Disney had agreed to, and the shooting schedule ran way longer than anticipated, which are two things that studios don't like, and having both of them happen at the same time is really bad news bears. So the CEO of Disney at the time was Michael Eisner, and he actually considered shutting down production of this film entirely, even as they had already made as much progress as they had once the budget reached $40 million. But studio chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg, who later went on to leave Disney to form DreamWorks SKG, he is the K in the SKG, he eventually was able to talk Michael Eisner out of it. Thank goodness for him. The budget ended up growing beyond 50 million even, which was a lot at the time. Basically, Disney was in this kind of tough spot where they were so excited to be working with Steven Spielberg on this project that they kind of just wanted to say yes to what he needed to do to make the movie. You know, it was like, don't want to make him unhappy kind of thing. So they said yes, because when Steven Spielberg is producing a movie with you, you tend to give him what he wants. Funnily enough, when they had pitched this movie to begin with, in their pitch meeting, they had said the budget we think we need for this movie is $50 million. Disney said no and told them to make it for $30 million. So they agreed. They were like, okay, I guess we'll make this movie for $30 million. And then over the course of production, it ballooned up to 40 million and eventually 50 million, which kind of frustrated me because it's like they were accurate about what the budget needed to be. Like they clearly had cut everything that they could cut when they made that pitch in the first place, you know? Anyway, I digress. The film was released under Disney's Touchstone Pictures banner on June 22nd, 1988. If you're unfamiliar, Touchstone is a banner that Disney sometimes releases movies under when they don't want them directly associated with the Disney name for reasons related to maybe more mature content, maybe more adult themes. They don't necessarily want it reflecting on their brand in general, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this movie that was considered a headache and this like thorn in Disney's side ended up grossing $329.8 million worldwide. Take a second to let that sink in. It received like rave reviews from critics and audiences alike. Critics in particular praised its visuals, its humor, its writing, and its performances. And it's really known for making massive strides in terms of its animation. There's a scene in particular with a lamp that gets referenced constantly if you were an animation student. It is like I would say in its own way, it's to animation what like Citizen Kane is to Film 101 students, you know, where like you watch it to see how massively ahead of its time it was when it was made. And then you kind of take away like, well, what can we take away from this? What does this say about the craft and what's important and what's not and blah, 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 blah. It actually was one of the highest grossing films of 1988, and it's widely considered to have played a big role in ushering in the golden age of American animation, spearheading both modern American animation and the Disney Renaissance, which occurred in the late 80s to mid 90s. Films associated with the Disney Renaissance period include The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast. In addition to being critically and commercially acclaimed, it actually even went so far as to win 3 Academy Awards, which is not something that Disney movies were necessarily always winning back then. That was pretty significant at the time. So they won the Academy Award for Best Film Editing, Best Sound Effects Editing, and Best Visual Effects. And obviously all 3 of those categories are very important in their own ways, but the best visual effects, I think, is the one that stands out the most in terms of what made this film so unique. Seeing human performers interact with animated characters. They even won a Special Achievement Academy Award for its animation, which was directed by Richard Williams. Robert Zemeckis is credited as the director of the film, but he was the director of the live action portions. So, fun fact, those are actually separated in terms of jobs. They're 2 very different skill sets. And then finally, in 2016, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was selected by the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for preservation for reasons being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. This movie genuinely was really groundbreaking and paved the way for other groundbreaking films that were yet to come. For instance, Beauty and the Beast being the first ever animated feature to be nominated for Best Picture. This was before a Best Animated Feature category existed. There was only one Best Picture. And Disney's Beauty and the Beast was the first one to ever be nominated for it. You can kind of see the ripple effects of this, not just in terms of Disney history, but also in terms of its influence on things like Space Jam. If you're a Space Jam fan, we wouldn't have Space Jam without Roger Rabbit. Just saying. Putting it out there. So, it was such a massive success that they immediately wanted to talk sequels. At the time, they had been, and when I say they, I mean Michael Eisner, who was the CEO, and Roy E. Disney, who was the vice chairman of the Walt Disney Company. They initially had felt that it was too risque for Disney. It had too many overt sexual references. It seemed a little bit much for their brand. But because director Robert Zemeckis had final cut privilege, he just refused to make any changes to that. And it was a gamble that paid off. The film was massively successful. So much so that Disney was like, immediately, what's the next one? What new Roger Rabbit movie are you going to do? Now, I find this interesting because I don't know how old J.J. Abrams is, but this math seemed really weird in my head. So Roger Rabbit came out in 1988. Disney immediately started planning and prepping for the sequel in 1989. So it was that successful that it happened immediately right after. J.J. Abrams was only 23 years old at the time, but he was in talks with Steven Spielberg to write the sequel. Basically, his draft ended up being abandoned. He did create an outline for it, but they ended up deciding not to use it. So then they hired a writer called Nat Maudlin. The prequel was going to be called Roger Rabbit, the Toon Platoon. And I just have to read this word for word because I need to be sure that I'm getting it right because it's a little wild. This is the plot for the proposed Roger Rabbit sequel. It would have covered Roger's early years living on a farm in the American Midwest and cover him meeting Jessica Krupnick, an aspiring actress and his eventual future wife. The crux of the plot was to be and just listen hard to this bit. Jessica being kidnapped and forced to make pro-Nazi German broadcasts, leading to Roger and his human friend Richie entering Nazi-occupied Europe in an army platoon to save her. The movie would end with the reveal that Roger's father was in fact Bugs Bunny. Nani? What? What? I have a lot of thoughts about this. One, why did you think this was a good idea? Two, of all the potential plots to put them through, that was the one you came up with? And three, we're just gonna rewind for a second, and I'm gonna remind you that they pitched this to Steven Spielberg, who was fresh off of making Schindler's List. So he left the project entirely. And this was a project he genuinely cared about. This was not just like a paycheck kind of thing. He felt like he could not be a part of anything creating satire surrounding Nazis after having gone through what he did with the making of Schindler's List. And he was like, okay, I'm out then, which, yeah, I don't know why the person who suggested this in the first place wasn't out. What? Hello? Funnily enough, in a case of too little too late, the plot was scrapped and a rewrite was commissioned by Eisner in 1997 that removed the World War II subplot. So just to remind you, Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out in 1988. They immediately started planning for a sequel in 1989, but by 1997, they still didn't have a script or even a story locked. It was at this point, however, that they hired Alan Menken to write 5 songs for the film. And he is a widely praised, celebrated Disney composer and like regular collaborator of theirs. So that was kind of a step in the right direction if they wanted to make it a musical, which I guess apparently they did. Who knows? So they ended up finally making some progress by 1998. They shot some test footage to show to the studio, but they had waited so long from the late 80s to the late 90s. Does anybody remember around the year 1997, 1998, what was happening in the world of animation? What was kind of shaking things up and changing the way things were done? Pixar, and more specifically, the introduction of CGI-heavy animated family films. At this point, they had waited so long to like get on with it, with making this, that now they no longer felt like they could just do 2D hand-drawn animation and live actors. So the test footage that they showed in 1998 was a blend of CGI, traditional animation, and live action. They then did a second test where the tunes were just completely CGI, but technology back then obviously wasn't what it is today, and the process would have been way too expensive in the 90s to do what they felt was the level of quality needed to make it kind of like a worthy sequel to the original. Because keep in mind, even though the original was 2D hand-drawn traditional animation, it was still groundbreaking at the time. And it seems as if they didn't want to take a step back with the sequel. They wanted the sequel to be looking forward, you know? They didn't want to compromise. So basically, if they were going to pull this off successfully using CGI, the budget required would have been $100 million. And that's without adjusting for inflation. Adjusting for inflation, that's $167 million today. That is an obscene amount of money for them to be spending back then. Granted, we have movies today that have $100 million budgets, but not in the way that at the time, $100 million budget for an animated sequel to a movie that made $329 million. Like, that was just not going to happen. So after 10 years of trying to get this movie off the ground, Eisner actually felt that it would just be best to cancel it at this point, because aside from the cost, it was kind of felt that public tastes had changed since the original movie had been made 10 years ago. So with all of that taken into account, that's why they did not end up making the sequel at the time. But they did have a very lucrative Roger Rabbit franchise. They had multiple novels, animated short films, comic books, video games, toy tie-ins. They did a McDonald's promotional run where you could get like McDonald's made cups in 1989 with Roger Rabbit characters on them. And of course, one of the biggest examples of what they did with this property was Toontown in Disneyland. The movies come out, we're back in 1988, 1989-ish, and Disney obviously is aware that this film that was once a thorn in their side actually ended up being quite lucrative, and that there's quite an opportunity here to expand. As they're trying to figure out a sequel on one track here, the other track is they want to start creating tie-in content for Roger Rabbit at the theme parks. If you're unaware, one of the strengths of the theme parks, and one of the reasons why they're able to put as much money into them as they do, is not just purely for the sake of earning money back on them, but they are part of what's called vertical integration. And vertical integration in business, if you are unfamiliar, is basically like, you know, Disney has a movie coming out. So at Disneyland, they're going to have characters walking around. They'll have a little themed area themed around the film, thereby raising awareness of it when people are there visiting. They will have merchandise sold in Disney stores that are tied into the film. The companies that they have brand deals with, so like snacks, you know, fruit roll-ups, cereal, Kellogg cereals, whatever it might be, will put them on the box, the characters, the toys inside. Fast food restaurants that they have ties with. It's anything that's within Disney's domain that they are then using to promote the same thing. So it's like seeing the commercials for it all the time on Disney's own TV show, TV network, Disney Channel, getting exclusive first looks on the Disney Channel, the songs playing on Radio Disney back when Radio Disney was a thing. It's basically like when a media company, in this example, owns so many different things, creating so many different types of content and experiences, and they use all of them to promote one product. It's synergizing all of the tools at their disposal to push something. And theme parks for Disney, obviously, they do make some money off of them, but largely, this is where they are beneficial, is having tie-in elements in a theme park to better promote pushing merch with those characters, brand awareness of those characters, so things like home video sales don't decline as quickly as they might otherwise. It keeps the characters also in the sort of cultural zeitgeist, meaning if you continue to release new merch with them, it's less likely that people are going to go, who's that Roger Rabbit character? You're going to reach a point where kids know Roger Rabbit as a character from the theme parks and have no idea that he has a movie, but they still want to buy the plushies and the t-shirts and the pins and the everything else Disney gets you to spend your money on. It's like a marathon, not a sprint, in terms of how you keep these properties making you money for very, very, very long periods of time. So they were like, this Roger Rabbit thing is just going so well. We clearly need to get him into the theme park. What are we going to do? And the plan was for Roger Rabbit to get an entirely new land devoted to him. If you are not a big theme park person, a land is basically like its own area of the park. And usually a land will have multiple attractions, restaurants, shops, character meet and greets. Like, it's an entire area of the park insulated with its own theming. So it was originally planned, if you are familiar with the layout of Disney, to be behind Main Street, USA, and it would be called Hollywood Land. There were going to be multiple specific attractions centered around the characters of Roger Rabbit, Judge Doom, and Baby Herman. These were planned for major expansions at Florida's Disney's Hollywood Studios and in Tokyo Disneyland, funnily enough. We don't have a ton of information about the ride concepts because this was such a long time ago and it never made it very far into development. But we do know that Baby Herman's ride would be called Baby Herman's Runaway Baby Buggy, and it would take guests right into the middle of a Roger Rabbit / Baby Herman cartoon, just like how the movie starts. It would be the tummy trouble short. Guests would be loaded into a dark ride style baby carriage. So like the car that you would load into to go through the ride would look like a little pram, the one that Baby Herman gets pushed around in. And the storyline would be that you are Baby Herman's replacement for the shoot. You're the stand-in actor who's going to be playing Baby Herman. It was described by an Imagineer as a ride that would zoom guests through cartoon sets of Toontown Hospital. You would be sent flying downstairs, crashing through doors, and bounding over beds. Actually sounds kind of fun to me. I don't know, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like a slightly more fast-paced and active, like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, almost. There would also be a portion of the attraction where you would make your way past Baby Herman's trailer on the lot, and you would hear him in his trailer throwing a tantrum. He would be saying things like, "That sequence is far too dangerous for a star like me to perform, Raoul. You better go hire some stuntmen to take my place in that scene." And so that's who you are. You're the stuntmen doing all the dangerous stunts that Baby Herman doesn't want to do himself. It sounds like a really fun ride, honestly. And then the last of the 3 proposed attractions would be called the Toontown Trolley. Guests would board a simulator ride, similar in size and scale to that of the original Star Tours, if you are familiar with the attraction Star Tours at Disneyland. The main difference would be that guests would be surrounded by screens instead of just looking forward. So in Star Tours, you're sat almost movie theater style. And in this one, there would be screens all around you for like an immersive experience. And it would be like your seat causing motion kind of thing as Roger Rabbit drives the trolley through Toontown. And it was supposed to be like a silly, high speed kind of thing. So we're getting to my favorite part here, which is explaining why this didn't happen. I'm curious if anyone has heard me talk about theme parks before and complain about all of the amazing things we could have had if it weren't for one big blunder that was happening at this time at the Walt Disney Company, Disneyland Paris. At the time, it was called Euro Disney. It was Michael Eisner's big project. It was allegedly, Michael Eisner thought of himself as Walt, as the next Walt. He wanted people to see him as a figure the same way Walt Disney was seen and love him like that, and to see him as representative of Disneyland and the parks. And I think a lot of his issues and where a downfall started to happen was where he tried too hard to be someone he wasn't, and then didn't handle it well when it didn't go well. So Euro Disney was his big project. It was going to be their next big theme park. And there's a whole long list of reasons why it didn't work. It's actually really fascinating breaking down exactly why they lost so much money on what they thought was like a slam dunk idea for a theme park. If you're interested in me making a video just on that and like the failing of Euro Disney, let me know, because I know a lot about that and I could definitely talk about it. But basically, it failed so spectacularly that plans had to be cut back across the board. There are so many attractions, so many lands, so many improvements, characters that we just never got because the failure of Euro Disney put them in such a tight spot financially that it had ripple effects that we're still feeling the effects of in 2021. Only Disneyland and Tokyo Disneyland received anything Roger Rabbit themed at all. So we've cut out Florida from the equation at this point. And it's no longer an entire land called Hollywood Land. Now they're like, we'll just give them an attraction. You know, we have ideas for 3 different attractions. We're just gonna pick one, and that's how we're gonna compromise. But this is gonna be fun. Remember what happened after they pitched their proposed plot for the sequel to Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Remember who immediately exited the project after hearing that they wanted to make it about infiltrating the Nazis? Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg was like, peace, I am out. I just finished Schindler's List. I'm not doing this. Absolutely not. So remember that these things are kind of happening in tandem. They're running parallel to each other. Separate departments working on the same IP, just doing different things with it. So at this point, they're like, hey, we are ready to start working on this attraction. We're ready to bring it to life. But they couldn't move forward without the approval of Steven Spielberg's production company, Amblin. And Amblin Entertainment co-owned the rights to the characters. So they had a say in how the characters were used, how they were depicted, what they said, what situations they were put in. And they had, reportedly, creative differences with Disney. Creative differences. Isn't that what it always comes down to with these things? I swear, I have like never heard anyone use a different reason when it comes to why did you stop working on this project? At this point, Hollywoodland has been scrapped. Things are looking kind of dire. They know that's still way too high. They know that they need to do something with Roger. They need to capitalize on the massive success that this movie was, but they don't quite know where to put it, what to do with it, and how to make it happen with all of these wrenches that have been thrown into this project. So, at the time, they were planning a land behind Fantasyland to honor Mickey Mouse's 60th birthday. The land where you celebrate Mickey's birthday being called Mickey's Birthday Land? What? Yeah. So they ended up combining these two ideas from Mickey's Birthday Land, which was obviously meant to celebrate 60 years of Mickey Mouse, and Hollywood Land, which was meant to bring to life the areas seen in the version of Hollywood depicted in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. They decided to sort of take what was best from both of these and combine them to form Mickey's Toontown, which is the land that we now have today. It opened in 1993 behind Fantasyland at Disneyland. So we finally got there, 1993. We have something in the park. It kind of seemed like it was never gonna happen. This is, at this point, 5 years after the movie was released. This land is open. Obviously, we all know why, going back to Euro Disney ruining it for us all. Most of these attractions were geared towards very young children. So this was meant to be, of all the lands in the park, this was the one that was most geared towards little kids. The Disneyland version of the long-awaited Roger Rabbit ride called Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin opened on January 26th, 1994, a year after Mickey's Toontown itself had initially opened. I will walk you through the ride while we do this. Before I get too into my eyeliner, I want to make sure I read this quote correctly because it's from an Imagineer, Joe Lanzacero, who described the creation of the ride saying, "This ride grew out of really Disney technology. Even though we wanted to do something new and cutting edge, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So this is really a hybrid of existing technologies in the park. We physically went to one of our existing dark rides, which is a ride vehicle that runs along a bus bar, and we looked at the teacups, which are on a little post that spins around. We took a teacup one night off the teacup ride, put it on Pinocchio, and went through the ride to see how these two technologies work together. And it was a marriage made in heaven. If you haven't been on the ride before, that already kind of gives you a bit of an insight into what it's like, but it is a dark ride where your vehicle has the ability, as he mentioned, to spin. Oh, no. Oh, no. Okay. I mean, all things considered, that could have gone way worse. So, the plot of the ride really starts before you even enter the ride vehicle. As with a lot of Disney rides, the queue itself, where you are lining up, gives you a lot of story information, a lot to look at, a lot to be entertained by, and it kind of gives the ride a bit more dimension when you're on it because you know what the story is, who the characters are, what they're doing. So, you start the ride by queuing up at the Toontown Cab Company. If you remember the movie, there is a character who is a taxi cab. So, you can kind of see where it's going. But the queue winds its way through darkened Toontown streets and alleys, passing through the Ink and Paint Club's backstage area. So you get to see Jessica Rabbit's changing room, you see the prop cage, you go past the window of Baby Herman's apartment, and you can even see shadows of the Toon Patrol plotting to dip the city. If you don't know what dip is, it's like a toxic sludge substance that can destroy toons. So it is bad, 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 bad. And so as you're walking through the queue, you can hear character voices. Basically, the Toon Patrol, you overhear them discussing their plans. And you also hear Jessica talking on the phone outside of her dressing room door. So once you have finally made your way through the queue, you're boarding the ride vehicle. Your ride vehicle is a yellow Toon cab named Lenny the Cab, who is the twin cousin of Benny the Cab. Once the traffic lights that very adorably have you stopped at the loading dock for guests to get in and out of the cabs, once those lights change to green, the cabs leave the loading area. There are 3 of the weasels that you immediately run into. Their names are Stupid, Greasy, and Wheezy. They're dumping barrels of dip into the streets. And that's what immediately sends Roger Rabbit and Benny the Cab spinning out of control, and what sends the guest's cab out of control as well. That's when your steering wheel becomes active and you can spin the cab around yourself. So if you've ever been on a ride like the teacups at Disneyland, there's like an outer track mechanism that will move the cup around this circular track, but you can move it in circles depending on how fast you twist the wheel at the center. Same thing with this ride, except instead of it just being a big loop main track, it's a dark ride that's taking you through and telling you a story. So the cabs then continue to make their way onward. They crash into a china shop run by a bull who is just like desperately trying to protect his stock from these out of control taxis. You then exit the shop, you travel down Spin Street, it's called, where you have these fire hydrants, power cables, mailboxes, streetlights. They're all anthropomorphically laughing and dancing around, and you're seeing the happy side of Toontown, essentially. Before you enter The next zone, which is the Toontown Porterhouse, they pass a furnace who has an abstract face, and you basically encounter Roger Rabbit having an electricity fight with a character named Psycho, which I have questions about. As you pass through these explosions, the cabs fall down from Toontown skyscrapers. And this whole time, Roger's like promising that he's going to fix everything. He's going to fix the mess that he's caused, which, like, you didn't cause it, Roger. The weasels did by dumping the dip out in front of where taxis are driving. That's a safety hazard. Whatever. Anyway, then they enter the gag factory, which is where they drive past a bunch of different like jokes and gags and comedic bits and all of that good stuff. You basically drive past Jessica Rabbit, who has been bound and gagged, and she's in the trunk of a car that belongs to one of the weasels. So Roger is trying to make his way to the weasels for this final confrontation. Jessica manages to free herself. She attacks Greasy and Wheezy, and Stupid. These are their names. They're meant to be a play on, there were originally supposed to be 7 of them, and they were supposed to be like alternate versions of the 7 dwarfs from Snow White and the 7 dwarfs. So you'll notice their names are supposed to be opposite of like Sneezy, Happy, Dopey, Doc, things like that. Anyway, just as Smarty is operating the dip machine and is like about to drop the dip on the cabs, you narrowly escape, and Roger saves the day. He stretches his arms out, and he uses a portable hole, which is a gag bit from the movie, and he kind of like pulls it in front of you so you can drive through it to return safely to the Toontown Cab Company. It's actually a really, really, really cool effect. So here comes the warning. If you do not want to talk about anything related to child harm, like I said, I will be keeping that portion of it as brief as possible, but it is important in the history of, just in the park's history in general, and in terms of what it did for safety features moving forward. I would like to say something that really bothers me about this. So I grew up in Southern California. I'm from LA, and this was like an urban legend of sorts for us when I was a kid, because it was something that happened close to our hometown with a child, and we were children. And it was something that, like, I remember as a kid hearing so many different variations on what happened and not really knowing 100% what it was. It seemed more like an urban legend than a thing that had actually happened, which I think we'll talk about in a minute in terms of how much information the general public got and like how this case was treated. But okay, January 26th, 1994, Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin opens in Mickey's Toontown. On September 22nd, 2000, a young child was trapped underneath the ride. He was only 4 years old. Records show that Disney employees in the communication center did not call 911 until about 5 minutes after the ride had been stopped. And the state report notes that a ride operator first elected call their supervisor in the break room before calling 911. There's a lot to unpack there. I think the most glaringly obvious of them for me is a lack of sufficient training for emergency protocols. If your staff thinks that what they need to do to respond to something like this is to talk to their supervisor first and not call 911, that is proof that whatever safety and emergency training you've given your staff is not adequate. You should know exactly what to do if something like this happens. And then on the flip side, if that is them knowing exactly what to do, if that's genuinely what they taught them to do, like in the event of an emergency, supervisors are the ones who should be speaking to the police or to paramedics or whatever it might be, then that is not adequate safety protocol. To wait until you can get a hold of your supervisor who's in the break room to call an ambulance when a 4-year-old child is trapped underneath a moving ride vehicle it's unknown exactly to what extent further damage may have been caused from that, but it's very easy to picture a situation in which this went better if it had been handled better, essentially. So, emergency protocol at the parks changed on October 7th, 2000. Disneyland updated their safety and emergency procedures, including training on 911 call procedures for employees. Employees were now told to call 911 immediately from any Disney phone. Phones were stationed at every attraction, every store, and every hotel. The call would be routed to the park's communications center, which had a direct line to police and fire departments. Managers in the center had also received training from Anaheim fire officials, so they were able to quickly acquire and communicate important information in an emergency. So the people who were at this call center got additional training to make sure that they were going to be equipped to point people in the right direction and speed up the process overall. So this is where I start to get a little frustrated. When explaining this new policy, let's talk about this time frame again. September 22nd is when this child is injured after getting trapped under the ride vehicle. October 7th is when they implement these new safety procedures, including the 911 calls that were failed to be made in a timely manner in the instance of the young boy. So, what do you think Disney attributed these new training procedures to? When asked, hey, why are you suddenly making people do this training? Logically, what do you think Disney said? So, a ride operator and 2 senior trainers claimed that many of the new training procedures were implemented after a prior accident involving the Columbia sailing ship attraction, which then motivated Disneyland to overhaul its emergency and safety procedures. Disneyland officials refused to comment on the accident that injured the young boy and claimed the timing of the changes happened to be coincidental. As one senior trainer said, the policy reviews are ongoing. A likely story. On December 29th, the year 2000, Cal OSHA released their report on the incident. They placed their blame on the ride design as well as the operator's failure to follow previously established protocol. Obviously, Disneyland disagreed with the report, and they refused to accept blame. A 4-year-old was gravely injured in their theme park, and they refused to accept blame. They stated that they would comply with the report's requirements, they would implement any recommended changes, but that them implementing these changes was not an admission of guilt. So, this OSHA report also did a bit of a deep dive into, well, how did this happen in the first place? The child was placed in an improper spot in Lenny, the cab, the ride vehicle. On the outside of the cab, you have the cut out where you can walk through to get into, the cab. Normally, if you're riding with like 2 older kids and 1 little one, 2 parents and a little one, a parent, an older kid and a little one, whatever it is, you put the smallest in the middle. They have pictures even showing that in like very simplified drawings to illustrate that. That's supposed to be the procedure. Instead, he was seated. His mother was on the outside. His older brother was in the middle, and the young 4-year-old was sat at the edge next to the open gap where you load in and out of the vehicle. And ride operators neglected to properly lower the lap bar. What I don't know is if they lowered it but didn't pull up to check that it had clicked. Because you can like start to pull it down, but not pull it down all the way. It's unclear if they saw them start to pull it down but didn't confirm that it was secure, or if they just didn't lower the lap bar altogether. Either way, neither of those options are acceptable, and neither of those options follow protocol that we are taught there. Disney claimed they believed the child was seated furthest from the entryway. And because of statements from employees, they believed the lap bar had been properly secured. Despite the amount of research I did, I was unable to find any interviews or sources to corroborate the claim that the lap bar was secure or that the child was seated not next to the exit, essentially. So Disney was saying, well, like, as far as we're aware, it was done right. But no matter how hard I searched, I could not find anything to back up them having any reason to believe that that was true. This is a real quote from Jeffrey Paul, who was general counsel, aka a legal representative for the Disneyland Resort. This is a statement he made following the release of this OSHA report. Quote, "The injury to," child names here, "was not the result of any negligence or wrongdoing on our part." Another park spokesman, Ray Gomez, said, "We felt all along this was an inherently safe ride. It's a very slow, gentle ride." I'm going to give you a minute to just let that one sit. There's many injustices in this world that make my stomach turn, but a multi-billion-dollar corporation telling parents whose son has just been gravely injured at the age of 4 that it wasn't their fault, they're not liable, there was no negligence or wrongdoing on the part of the theme park, they're essentially blaming the parent and the kids. They are a billion-dollar corporation, and this was just a regular family visiting their theme parks. Like, this is the same company that I worked for when I injured my spine, by the way, to give you an idea of how that was handled and why I'm in pain on a daily basis with my spinal injury. So anyway, just keeping that in mind. So, like any rational supervillain with no conscience would do, Disneyland said, OSHA reports. I don't think so. We're conducting our own investigation. Can we get an unbiased third party in here? Or should we, the people who are in the wrong, hire someone to perform biased tests to confirm the story that we are trying to put out there? That's exactly what they did. Disney hired Thomas Sabo, I think it's pronounced, an independent biomechanical engineer, to run tests using an adult female and 2 dummies the size of 3 and 6-year-old children. Sabo claimed they conducted worst-case scenario tests with lap bars up and the smallest child seated next to the open entryway. Len Welsh, who is special counsel to Cal OSHA, who released the scathing report saying Disneyland was at fault, reviewed the study and noted that the design was faulty since the study didn't address what could happen with a real child, i.e., dummies do not move the way humans do, and certainly do not move the way 4-year-old children do. And nothing in their report acknowledged that this was in any way an oversight or something that they were failing to investigate. So, anyway, OSHA's report did have some changes that they demanded before Disney could be allowed to reopen the ride. And these included installing a sensor skirt guard around the bottom of each car that will stop the ride instantly when it touches an obstruction. Because keep in mind, that's what this injury was this child being caught underneath the ride vehicle as it continued to move. Another thing that they asked for was to place doors on any currently open entryways. So for the cab to not just be open, but to have little doors. And to ensure training manuals for the ride, which would explicitly and clearly state safety policies for seating passengers and for securely closing the doors. Disneyland also elected to add more signs to the ride area, as well as within the ride cars, warning passengers to please remain seated, keeps your hands, arms, feet, and legs inside the ride vehicle at all times. You know that little spiel they do? That's when they added the recorded audio warning. So anytime you're on a Disney ride and you're hearing them do that, please keep your hands, arms, feet, and legs, that's why they started doing this. No fines. Absolutely none. There were no fines given to Disneyland. Apparently, the regulations being enforced had not yet been enacted as state law. So did Disney have to pay a fine for this? Absolutely not. It's only changing the life of this 4-year-old and his family for forever. Why would you have to pay for that in the slightest? Len Walsh commented that Disneyland did not appear intentionally negligent or uncooperative with the investigation. He was quoted as saying, "There didn't appear to be any attempt to hide anything," which we appreciate, even though we may disagree on some of the analysis of what happened. So basically, when it comes down to it, they didn't disagree on the facts of what happened necessarily. Disneyland was basically just saying, we didn't need to do more than we did to ensure this passenger's safety. Whereas OSHA is saying, yes, you did. Did you follow the protocols you have in place? It's debatable about the lap bar, but besides that, yes, they followed the protocols they had in place. The argument is less about following them and more about the fact that those practices were not safe and not enough to protect riders. So, January 2nd, 2001, just a couple months after the accident happened, the family of the injured child sues Disneyland, accusing them of negligence, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They sought unspecified damages, as well as civil trial by jury. Charges included in the suit are that Disneyland created dangerous ride conditions that allow passengers to be ejected, that seating this child closest to the entryway that was wide open should not have happened because it allowed for him to more easily fall out. The employees were inadequately trained in emergency procedures. They also said that previous accident that was referred to with the sailing ship Columbia, the changes that they attributed to that accident should have been implemented instead of waiting for another accident to occur. So basically they used those words against them and were like, if you were implementing changes from this horrific accident, that should have happened a lot sooner to prevent another horrific accident. You knew that you could be doing more, so that's bullshit. They attempted to block state legislation that increases safety and reporting requirements at amusement parks. So this family is also suing Disney for their actions in trying to prevent legislation from passing that would increase safety regulations. Why would they be against safety regulations? Why would they try so hard for that not to be implemented? Capitalism. They don't want to spend money making those changes and having to update anything, even at the cost public safety, of the safety of not just the people that attend their theme parks, but the children, the infants, the toddlers, the adolescents that attend their parks, that give them their revenue in the first place. They didn't want to lose a fraction of that profit. I've looked to see if there are any public documents from this suit that are available. I don't know enough about the law to know what kind of stuff is sealed versus not sealed, or how to track something like this down when it's so many years ago and is not a very big case. For as awful as this case is, as we discuss it, it only gets 2 sentences on the Roger Rabbit cartoon spin Wikipedia devoted to it. It's literally like, this accident happened with this kid. Here's how it got resolved. Which is absurd to me once you start going down this rabbit hole of looking into what happened. God, it makes me so mad. Anyway, so July 12th, 2001, Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin reopens after Disney makes multiple safety modifications to both the ride area and the ride cars themselves. February 1st, 2002, so almost exactly 2 years after filing this lawsuit against Disney, the family of the child reaches an undisclosed settlement with Walt Disney Company. It's estimated, based on prior settlements and the serious reduction in this child's quality of life, that the amount they would have won would allegedly, maybe, possibly go between $20 to $30 million. However, according to a joint statement by the Walt Disney Company and the family of the child's attorneys, the amount was enough to guarantee the child will continue to receive the finest medical care for the rest of his life. I will drop another trigger warning here if you're sensitive to hearing any kind of medical details, especially those pertaining to young children. I know that can be really distressing. At this time, Brandon is now 6 years old, still hospitalized at Healthbridge Children's Rehabilitation Hospital in Orange. He was unable to talk, unable to walk, and was completely reliant on a feeding tube. He is able to respond to his parents, capable of laughing and smiling, which was an achievement well beyond the expectations of his medical staff that tended to him. His parents plan to use the money from the settlement to return to the area that they were from. Up until then, he'd been receiving treatment at a hospital close to Disney, essentially, and to have their son live at home with them, using the money to presumably cover in-house medical assistance. On January 25th in 2009, the child was found unresponsive in his home by his father and was taken to St. Joseph's Hospital. He was then retransferred to Children's Hospital in Orange. By the next day, he's now 13 years old, and he passes away from the injuries that he sustained in the accident, somewhere around 1:10 to 1:15 in the morning. I briefly mentioned that he had been under the ride vehicle. I think it's a very delicate line between you don't want to sensationalize any kind of violence or harm that has come to anyone, especially not a child. And so I don't share these details as like a salacious, gossipy way, but more so, I think it's important to recognize this was not a minor injury that they were like, oh, some kid's broken arm we don't have to deal with. The accident itself, he got pinned underneath the ride vehicle and was dragged for 10 feet throughout the track, stuck underneath, folded forward at the waist by the pressure from the vehicle for 10 straight minutes. That's how long it took for the cast members to provide any kind of medical assistance to him. His injuries sustained included a fractured pelvis, broken tailbone, ruptured diaphragm, lacerated spleen, a collapsed left lung, internal bleeding, and an experienced cardiac arrest, which induced severe brain damage. It's not confirmed, but reported in some accounts that he may have even lost his vision at the time. He was 4 years old. This is a 4-year-old child. And I just want to go back for a moment and read these quotes from the representatives of the Disneyland Resort with that in mind. Jeffrey Paul, the general counsel for Disneyland, released this statement. The injury to the child was not the result of any negligence or wrongdoing on our part. Park spokesman Ray Gomez said, "We felt all along this was an inherently safe ride. It's a very slow, gentle ride." Those quotes are sinister enough on their own. The stark contrast between when you know the specifics of the injury and when you don't, I think makes it even more deplorable and despicable and evil. Truly, truly evil. Once you hear exactly what that child was put through, and then you hear how vehemently they deny any wrongdoing. They deny that the new safety protocols they have in place are even as a result of this child's injuries. It's just so far beyond disrespectful to his family, to his memory. It's just a completely preventable tragedy that they dug their heels in completely unnecessarily. Disney could afford to pay out this lawsuit. And they did. Even with those absolute bullshit statements that they made. And truly, let's be real, lies that they told. There's no reality in which they did not have culpability for this completely unnecessary and tragic loss of a young life. They lied through their teeth and still ended up paying out 20 to 30 million. And it is sickening and devastating that this young boy's safety regulations at theme parks. So in a broad sense, they were aware that they weren't doing enough and they were actively trying to prevent the need to do more. But beyond that, they had had another accident at the sailing ship Columbia, which if you're interested in me ever talking about that in a video, let me know. And they didn't make these changes after that. So there were on multiple counts where they had every reason to be aware that their safety protocols weren't up to snuff. Whereas you have a, 19, 20-year-old, it's their first time working in a theme park and they're a ride operator and they're following what they are taught textbook to a T. I can't imagine that individual thinking they know better than a theme park company that's been around doing this for 30 plus years. I can't imagine them being like, I know this is what I've been trained to do, but I'm gonna do it differently, you know? It's really, really rough. And this was basically a time in which it was like kind of a Wild West era for theme park regulations. This incident really marked a turning point in the history of tightened down restrictions and regulations in regards to emergency and safety practices and procedures at the theme parks. When I became a cast member many years later, we had a very intense, very, very intense safety and emergency training that we had to go through. And it was way more detailed than it sounds like what they used to do back then. So it definitely changed things for the better, and it definitely changed things for good. It should not ever, in any reality, have had to come to a child's life being put in danger and ultimately lost to make those changes. They knew better. They had every opportunity, and it was their greed that prevented them from doing the right thing. So after they update those guidelines and they make the requested changes, Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin reopens and remains, aside from a minor cosmetic enhancement years later, it remains largely flying under the radar until this year, 2021. We got a new update following sort of in the footsteps of recent changes made to the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, notably the Buy a Bride auction, which is no more. Disneyland has decided to give Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin a revamp from the story level up. Who Framed Roger Rabbit star Jessica Rabbit is now front and center, opening her own private eye detective agency in Toontown. The attraction will revisit the story of Roger Rabbit as he attempts to rescue his beloved wife Jessica Rabbit from the evil henchmen known as the Weasels. That was the original description for the Disneyland ride. The whole point of it was you're going along with Roger, you're trying to save his wife, who we missed it watching the clip earlier, but she is bound and gagged. She's like hogtied in a trunk of a car, and that's her first of 2 appearances in the ride. They have decided to reframe this. The scene with the trunk is now filled with barrels of dip that the Weasels are transporting instead of a bound and gagged Jessica. And the new plot kind of sort of centers around the return of the Toon Patrol Weasels as leading the surge of crime that has recently seen an uptick through Toontown. So, Jessica Rabbit takes inspiration from her longtime friend and legendary Toontown detective Eddie Valiant and decides to show the Weasels she means business by using her platform as a celebrity to take on cases that, the cops aren't adequately dealing with, kind of thing. And a quote from the website, which is an interview with Jessica. "Enough is enough," Jessica was heard exclaiming last week. "The good tunes of our neighborhood are afraid to come out at night, and it's getting worse by the day. Those Weasels are up to something big. I'm gonna find out what it is and put a stop to it. Watch out, Weasels, your reign of terror is over." As you can imagine, there's a certain subset of the internet that is absolutely frothing at the mouth, fuming that they are removing a hog-tied, bound and gagged damsel in distress character, Jessica, and turning her into the protagonist of the ride instead, where now she has motivation, she has agency, both personally, and she owns an agency now, and they are just absolutely livid. A lot of the time, these complaints are, these sexist complaints, call it what it is, are veiled under the excuse of, well, Walt worked on the original ride, and you shouldn't change things he worked on. So, Marty Sklar, former creative executive for the Walt Disney Imagineering, who worked with Walt Disney himself, then came out with a statement in response explaining, "I can't think of a single attraction that has not been enhanced or improved. Sometimes over and over again," he said. "Change is tradition at Disneyland that today's Imagineers practice. They learned it from their mentors, many of them Walt's original team of storytellers and designers, the Disney legends." I think the piece that is most important there, that he hit the nail on the head with, is change is a tradition. Nothing at Disney is ever meant to stay static. It's meant to change with the times. And you can preserve beloved elements of originals while still knowing and growing from past experiences, historical and social shifts. There is, in my opinion, absolutely nothing wrong with the fact that we are taking out the Buy a Bride portion, literally selling women off to be married to the highest bidder in Pirates of the Caribbean. Now it's a woman running an auction of pirated goods. Much better. Changing Jessica Rabbit from, I don't even want to get into the way they had her portrayed in this ride, to having an active role, I think is amazing. We don't get to see her character do that very much in the movie, and it's a welcome change to add depth to her character and a chance to reignite an interest in this attraction that is very much waning in popularity. We have Splash Mountain being updated to be a Princess and the Frog ride, which I think is a phenomenal idea. It ties into a Disney property that is still relevant Disney itself tries to bury and disown Song of the South. So clinging to those characters is not something that Disney is exactly loud and proud about. And the ride itself, fun fact, was called Splash Mountain because Michael Eisner at the time wanted to use vertical integration to promote the new Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah romantic comedy film Splash. It's not called Splash Mountain because it's a log flume ride. It's called Splash Mountain because Tom Hanks fucked a mermaid. I think that's the note that I'm gonna end on. Thank you so much for joining me today for this one. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about not only the history behind the long and difficult road it took to get this attraction into the park in the first place, but its ramifications and the ripple effects that it has caused that we are still feeling today in terms of updated emergency and safety protocol and practices in theme parks everywhere. I hope as well to have a takeaway of embracing innovative, authentic change. I don't believe that any of the changes being made in the park are change just for the sake of change. I think they are all motivated and rooted in a place of both modernization and character-driven pieces. And I'm so excited to see the new Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin. I'm so excited to see the new Splash Mountain, if it's still called that. And I have been riding the new Pirates of the Caribbean ride since they changed it, and I greatly prefer it. So let me know what you think. I tried to go for a kind of like Jessica Rabbit if she were doing e-girl graphic liner look with the makeup, and I don't have I'm using an eyebrow brush for my eyeliner, so I don't really have a liner brush that's as thin as I would have liked, but you know what? I'm not a makeup artist. We're working on it, okay? Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.